Welcome to Monday's edition of Big Blue Kickoff Live here on Giants.com as well as the mobile app. It's presented by Cadillac, the official luxury vehicle of the New York Football Giants. He's Paul Dottino. I'm Lance Meadow with you for the next 60 minutes. Thanks so much for tuning in. And as always, multiple ways you can interact with us here on the program. You give us a ring, 201-939-4513. You can also find us on social media, hashtag Giants Chat. He's at Giants WFAN. I'm at Lance Meadow, one word, last name, MEDOW. And as a reminder, you can find the archive of this show and our entire podcast network on the Giants mobile app, podcast platforms everywhere, and at Giants.com/podcast. So it is officially Combine Week, as the National Football League, not just the Giants, will all flock to Indianapolis. We'll have live broadcast beginning tomorrow from Indy. So Paul and I figured we'd set the stage for the Scouting Combine over the course of this program, as well as getting to other topics related to the New York Giants. And this is always an exciting time because it's not just so much that you see the prospects on full display, but I also look at it as it's an indication that we're also knocking on the door of the start of the new league year. And free agency is going to be here before it begins. Before you begin talking and delving into the draft and everything else. So, I mean, that I think is even more exciting maybe than the dynamics of what we're going to see in Indianapolis.
Well, Lance, you know how I feel about this. I have thought now for quite a while that the free agent period is going to be even more critical for the Giants than even the draft period will be because of their desperate need to find a starting quarterback. And I have been of the opinion now for a couple of months, certainly since November, to be frank with you, that the Giants were going to wind up getting themselves a veteran starter. And that's going to then set the dominoes in motion for what they will want to do, or at least try to do in the draft. And I do believe, as I've said many times before, I think the veteran quarterbacks who are apparently available in the marketplace are going to have a bigger impact on the 2025 NFL season than any of these rookie quarterbacks in the draft class. I firmly believe that. And nothing has changed my mind. I'll be at the Combine the next 4 days. John and I will be doing shows out there. I guess I'll start on Wednesday. I'm not getting there in time to do the show tomorrow. I'll be there a little bit late. But I expect that that's going to be quite the topic of conversation.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't expect anything to change my mind on that right now.
Well, I would agree with you. The reason I agree with your assessment is you don't have nearly as much volume in this year's quarterback class in terms of the guys going high in the draft as you did a year ago. So by default, there's a better chance for the free agency group to have a more significant impact on their new respective teams. Or the tradable group, certainly you can include that too. But even if you just want to operate with the free agents, you're not going to have 6 quarterbacks go that high in the first round. That we know. I mean, unless there are just stunning developments over the course of the next few weeks. And hey, there's always room to operate within those boundaries, but I would say it's very minute at this point of that happening. I'm glad you brought up the draft class in general, and Shedeur Sanders is not going to do much at the Combine. He already came out, but I don't know if you saw, Daniel Jeremiah had his pre-Combine press conference that he does with the media at this time every year, and he was asked about his assessment of specifically Sanders and Cam Ward of Miami, because most would consider those to be the 2 top guys. So he came out with his original ranking of this year's top 50 draft prospects a little bit prior to the Combine. He had Ward at number 10 overall. He had Sanders right behind him at number 11. However, when he met with the media just now before the Combine, he had indicated the next rankings that are going to come out, now there's going to be a little bit of a distance between those 2 quarterbacks, the more and more that he studied them. And I just want to read a comment here that he brought up to maybe showcase a bit of disparity. He said, quote, "I like Shedeur. I think Shedeur is, when you look at the things he does really well, the accuracy, anticipation, toughness, he just keeps getting up after taking a beating, but some of the other things that Cam has, he doesn't have," referring to Shedeur, which is just a little bit more twitch in his body. He has a more live arm, referring to Ward. I think he's more equipped to play in that division, in that stadium, in that environment that you're going to get with weather. I think Shedeur makes more sense just as relying a little bit more as a touch thrower than a power thrower. So I thought those were some interesting observations that Daniel Jeremiah brought to the forefront when dissecting both of these guys.
Well, to me, Lance, I think the real question, because it seems unanimous from everybody, retired scouts, coaches, current scouts and coaches who I've talked to, nobody has these quarterbacks in the top 10. They just don't, in terms of pure grade value. Now, could they be picked up there? Obviously. But nobody seems to believe that their grades are there. Now, in addition to that, when you talk to the people who do the draft for a living, right, your draft gurus, who spend 12 months out of the year doing this, they all seem to acknowledge the same thing, that these two quarterbacks are not that high on the grading chart, but they'll get pushed up. So the question becomes not only where do they go, but if the entire class is going to get pushed up because of the dearth of quarterbacks available and the amount of teams that still need one, where does the second tier go? Of which I believe Jackson Dart is the best one of the second tier. Some people think it's Milroe. I think it's Dart. Will a third quarterback sneak into the bottom of the first round simply because of the climate?
I think it's very possible. And it's not just so much climate, it's need. I mean, teams that are in need of a quarterback, Paul, regardless of whether or not he is equivalent to the third overall player in the draft, is irrelevant because you're talking about the most important position in football. Mm-hmm. And when you pick that high, which the Giants are in the position of, you can't take for granted you're going to be in a similar position the following year, or the class is as good. So what most teams feel is, okay, we're here now. There are a few quarterbacks. We're going to do our due diligence. And maybe it's too strong of a phrase to say we're going to sell ourselves on a guy, but they'll at least convince themselves, based on the homework they've done, that at least one of those players at that given position can fit within what they want to run. And that always tends to happen if you look at recent and past NFL history.
Now, what we do know is we begin the combine tomorrow. Today, actually, guys report, but the true spirit of the combine and stuff actually starts tomorrow. It does appear by, again, the consensus, defensive tackle is easily the deepest part of this draft, as well as there are plenty of really good running backs. And then the other position that I'm hearing, which is loaded with a lot of good players, not necessarily great players, but good players, corner. A lot of good corners in this draft.
Oh, that's a position of need for the Giants.
Not necessarily great ones, but a lot of good ones. And that's kind of the scuttlebutt going into Indianapolis. Now, once we're out there, and we start talking to people there, and the whispers are going around the room, and we're talking to prospects and then talking to a lot of other people that we know and cross-referencing with other NFL personnel, we'll get a better feel by the time we leave there if any of that has changed. I don't suspect it will, although there's an awful lot of late jabber or talk, jabber? Yeah, jabbering.
Yeah, chatter, you could say.
There's some late chatter that the tight ends class has a bunch of really good receiving tight ends. A couple of real stars at the top. We all know Warren is the top tight end in this draft. A couple good ones up there. And then a whole bunch of receiving tight ends who over the long term could actually make this a very nice tight ends class. Now, what there's not a lot of in this tight ends class are the blockers. If you're looking for somebody who can do all of it, be an inline guy, help you in the running game, and also be a pass catcher, you know, a George Kittle type who does everything, you're not really going to find very many of those. You'll find a lot of receiving tight ends and a few blocking tight ends that you'll be able to get later on in the draft. To be frank with you, I wouldn't mind if the Giants wound up on the third day, picked up a blocking tight end in the draft, because I see Theo Johnson and Bellinger as 1 and 2, but that third tight end, I suspect you would still like to have a third tight end on this team, and it's going to be a guy who's going to be able to push the pile and create room for your backs or help in pass protection. I think that guy's a blocker if I'm the Giants.
You could also accomplish that in free agency.
You could
bring in a veteran tight end.
You absolutely could, but that would cost you a little bit more money.
Sure.
Because like a fifth-round pick is going to be pennies on the dollar.
Well, but in fairness, Paul, if you look at it as a need, and I would agree with you, if it's of the now, I'd rather than invest the money in a veteran who's done it before than you bring in a young guy. You're going to have to get him to the level where he's comfortable in terms of blocking and helping the offensive line. It's not
that hard, though, to teach a rookie tight end to just be able to use your power, use your beef, and use your technique and be able to hold up as a blocker. Especially if you're the third tight end on a team, you're not going to play a lot.
So meaning in order to get on the field, I'm not questioning the desire of the player to learn, but I'm talking about the level of execution. You may be beneficial more so with bringing in a tight end who has had a few years in the league. That's all I'm saying. I don't think that going into the draft, if they didn't come out with a blocking tight end, I wouldn't look at that as a failure on their part, especially if they're able to bring in somebody in free agency, which they've done in years past. But if you look at, aside from analyzing the depth that you were just hitting on, the other thing that's going to be huge, especially as we bring the focus back to the quarterback, is the Giants are going to be able to get in the meeting room and talk to these guys and get to know them on a more personal level. Whether it's Shedeur Sanders, whether it's Cam Ward, to determine, in addition to whatever may be appealing or not from a skill set, who are they as individuals? And that is a key ingredient, especially given this market. And really, I would argue any market in the National Football League, because the stress that a quarterback is under is unlike any other spot on an NFL roster, especially if you're going to a team high in the draft that has its fair share of question marks. Can you handle going from a winning franchise in college football to being thrust into a situation where you're not winning nearly as much? I bring this up all the time. Alabama players, and I know Alabama maybe didn't have as an impressive of a year this year now that it's post-Nick Saban. But for the most part, all of those Alabama players over there, 3 years, let's say they didn't stay for all 4. You need one hand to go over how many games they lost, right? They then go to an NFL franchise, Paul, they wind up losing double the amount of games in 1 year than they had in their entire career at Alabama. So the reason why I'm bringing that up, and not to say that Shedeur Sanders and Cam Ward were coming from teams that were bulletproof or won national championships, but Sanders did a lot of winning even before he arrived at Colorado and at high school. And the same thing can be said for Cam Ward. So even if maybe they weren't having one-loss seasons religiously in college, they're still used to being competitive in a position to win just about every game. Now you may be going to a franchise that is the complete opposite end of the spectrum. How do you evaluate, Paul, whether or not a quarterback can handle that? That to me gets answered a little bit in the meeting at the Combine. And we've done Giants Life pieces in years past.
Yes.
And the best part of those Giants Life pieces, and I think our production team deserves a lot of credit, is capturing Brian Dable going through play calls, right? And seeing whether or not they can memorize it and then recite it back to him 5 minutes later after they had the conversation. The reason I'm bringing that up is I think you learn a lot in those meetings, maybe more so than what you're going to see on film, because you're not necessarily going to get to know the true thought process and who the individual is, which, let's not be naive, has a great deal of influence of what they can ultimately do on the NFL level on the field.
Well, we know that the personnel file over the years has become even more and more and more important than it did years and years ago. It's just part of the player's file now. You get the tape, you get the stats, and then you get all this other stuff.
Yeah.
And, let's face it, this is a business. And when you make a selection, you're investing not just in that player, but in that person. And, I don't think we need to stray too far. The Giants had a first-round pick a few years ago who wound up going awry and got involved in some very messy, sticky situations. And it didn't matter what round he was taken in. He was a first-round pick. And, that was just the beginning of a spiral of a guy who found himself out of the league relatively quickly.
I guess I'm not dismissing your point. I'm just looking at the quarterback so much more unique than any other player at any given position.
Well, it is, but I do think it goes across the board. Trust me, when the Giants coaching staff is conducting interviews at the Combine this week, they're talking to all the different positions, and they're taking all their notes on all of them. Now, you're absolutely right. The quarterback is the one that's going to be under the microscope the most. Nobody's disputing that. Obviously, it's an incredibly complex position. But this personality stuff that we're talking about and this interaction that we're talking about is from top to bottom. There's not a guy who's going to come into the Giants suite at the stadium in Indianapolis that's not going to get grilled on all of these things. And when he leaves, they're going to be like, okay, guys, let's compare notes. Everyone gets the car wash. You don't get through dry.
No,
everybody
sure.
goes through the car wash.
The soap, the water, the wax.
That's it.
Everything in between. You got to navigate it effectively. Yes, no. That is 100% accurate in terms of your assessment. I think this year maybe even more eyes are on the quarterbacks than in maybe previous years because of where the Giants are picking. The huge void right now as it stands on the roster, knowing that we have not been through free agency. And when you combine both of those forces, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to connect the dots to understand they're going to do their due diligence. Not to say they haven't done it in previous years, but the need is far more pressing going into this year's draft than in any of the previous years because Daniel Jones was on the roster in previous years.
No doubt.
No matter what you felt about Daniel, you still knew he was going to be here. You don't have Daniel Jones here anymore. You don't have the veteran quarterback either. So it's twofold. And those forces are going at one another.
Let's just, for argument's sake, say that Tommy DeVito does not return. We don't know for sure. He's a restricted free agent and the only quarterback that the Giants have any rights to as of today. Well, maybe the Giants have decided, you know what? Maybe we don't want to give him the tender offer and hold on to his rights. Maybe they decide they're going to move on. Well, if that's the case, okay, not only do they need the veteran quarterback to be their starter and then get a young project quarterback to be groomed, but they may also be in the market for potentially a third quarterback.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, they could bring in an undrafted guy potentially
for
that
could.
Third spot, put him on the practice squad. That's not crazy.
But there'll be guys at the Combine, and I've got the list of all the quarterbacks at the Combine. Some of these guys are not going to be drafted. And some of these meetings, et cetera, that go on, and I know there's only so many you can actually take in the suite, but you can also meet guys outside and at the hotel and stuff like that too.
Schmooze and so forth.
Yes, some of that stuff is going to be a fact-finding mission to where the Giants may be in their own mind saying, okay, we're pretty sure we're going to get Mr. X, the veteran, to be our starter. But we think we might want to have to fill out the second string and third string quarterback spots as well. So let's make sure we try to touch base with as many of these guys as we can to find out something else about them to see if we'd even want to bring them into the building to talk to.
Well, they're all in one place, so you might as well capitalize under the circumstances.
That's why the Combine is what it is.
That's why it was also developed this way, to make it convenient for all 32 teams. Because could you imagine if there wasn't a Combine? And you had to go all over the country. I mean, they do that for the pro days as it is.
Yes,
but let's say, okay, aside from the pro days, you still needed to gather other intel, or you wanted to have more intimate conversations. People would be flying all over the country, left and right. And you wouldn't be able to divvy it up, even with your staff, as many scouts that you have, to get real exposure for each position group. That's why the Combine is so valuable.
Without a doubt. And one of the reasons why Indianapolis is so valuable, and it's not just because it's in the middle of the country, which makes it centrally located for everybody in the league to get to, but the other reason is, logistically speaking, the way the hotels are set up and the convention center is set up and the medical facilities, which are terrific in Indianapolis and only a short, distance away. If anybody has a question about a player, and it's like, okay, we're not sure about your medical stuff. Are you willing to undergo an exam and a check? Within minutes, they can get that guy to the medical facility, and they can do a diagnostic and a check on it if everybody's willing to do it. So Indianapolis is the perfect place for it. Now, unfortunately, as we've heard for the last several years, the National Football League has tinkered and toyed with the idea out of putting the combine out for bid, because there are cities and tourism agencies from those cities that would love to get their hands on the amount of money that pours into the city when you have an NFL combine there.
It's an event.
Yes, it is. Now, to this point, the football minds have won, and the league has decided to stay put. But as you know, the last couple of years, it's been like on 1 or 2 year contracts because they don't want to commit to Indianapolis for too long for the right to potentially move the combine to the highest bidder. And Lord only knows that the National Football League is a marvelous attraction for many economic people who are looking to get a boost.
I just wonder, it's one thing to talk about the Super Bowl under that lens, given the fact that it's a tourist attraction. It doesn't really impact competitive advantage because of the logistics that you just hit on with respect to the combine. Something tells me all 32 teams are probably on the same page on this one, where they would campaign heavily to the league to say, hey, I understand there may be some more financial gain to be made, but under these circumstances, I think we need to evaluate the pros of the logistics and evaluating the personnel as opposed to the money to be made.
Those teams to this point have won the battle.
Correct, and that's why I'm indicating that.
They have pushed back the water to the other side of the dam.
Because there were whispers about maybe like L.A. taking it over.
Absolutely. Dallas
already. Yeah, but it has not happened.
No.
So the fact that it hasn't happened leads me to believe that the powers that be behind closed doors are winning because of, once again, the benefits in terms of the evaluation. Now, that doesn't mean that that's going to hold true moving forward, but I think there's more stock and substance under that argument than if the teams said, hey, keep the Super Bowl in one location or keep the Pro Bowl in one location. Because what's the difference where you have those games? Where you have the Combine, it's a bit of a different story.
Well, see, COVID changed a lot with the Combine, too. Yep. They were starting to blow out the Combine to be almost like a fan fest kind of thing. And then COVID came along, and that really put a tremendous amount of cold water on that situation. And it's never quite been as much of an event as it was before the COVID virus hit. That it hasn't rebounded, although they're doing everything they can to build it up again.
This is Big Blue Kickoff Live. It's presented by Cadillac, the official luxury vehicle of the New York Football Giants. Lance Meadow, Paul Dottino with you, setting the stage for the Combine. Let's open up the phone lines as we move forward here, and we check in with Alex in Syracuse. Alex, welcome aboard. What do you got for us?
Hey, guys. How you doing today? Lance, welcome back. Good to hear from you, man.
Appreciate it. It's good to be back. What do you have for us?
I want to talk quarterback situation just a little bit. I have sort of a larger point about the draft that I want to make, but just real quick. A lot of the rumors about Stafford, obviously, floating around lately. And I know you guys can't talk specific names, so I'm just going to kind of get through this real quick. Here's kind of my thought on that situation, which is not only I think Stafford's an incredible quarterback. Let's start with that. But I think he's the worst option for the Giants right now because you're going to have to trade for him, which means you're giving up capital, probably draft capital. You're still going to have to sign him to a Matthew Stafford level deal, which, even with the cap things expanding, that's going to take up a large portion of our cap on a team that still has a lot of other needs. And so to me, I think we need a bridge quarterback. And a bridge quarterback to me is like, it's the bus, right? It's the bus that you take from Teaneck, New Jersey over the George Washington Bridge into Harlem. You're not at the destination yet. You're just in the general area. To me, Matthew Stafford is like a subway quarterback. He's the guy that's going to get you from being already in the city to, downtown for the Super Bowl parade. Like, that's the guy you want on that situation. I also don't think Matthew Stafford would necessarily want to be in a situation like the Giants have. Not that he wouldn't want to be a Giant, but I just think he's a guy in his career where he wants to go somewhere where they're ready to compete and win kind of today, and I just don't know that that's the right fit, and I think it might actually hinder our ability to grow in the way that we're growing right now. So that's my Matthew Stafford thing. But here's actually the question that I wanted to ask you guys. Lance, I don't know if you heard, but Paul and John had a conversation last week where they were throwing some numbers around, talking about whether or not you draft a quarterback high and how important that is. It was a really good conversation with a lot of really good numbers. And the biggest takeaway was it's always kind of, you're taking a shot in the dark in a lot of ways. And Paul, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe the statistic was 21% of the quarterbacks who have played in a Super Bowl since, I think that have been drafted since 2000 were drafted at the first overall pick. Is that correct?
Let me look it up. The number, the primary number was that of the 28 starting Super Bowl quarterbacks since the 2000 season, only 15 of them were first-round picks, which is 53%. That was the primary number that the chart was built off of. But go ahead.
Okay. Well, go with me on this, because I'm pretty sure that, because I think there was a stat that was thrown out by John that was that 21% of that group that you're talking about was specifically chosen at the first overall pick, or let's even just call it the top 10. I think it was the first pick, but let's just say it was the top 10 for argument's sake. And I think your point was 21% is not very high, right? Like that's 79% that aren't picked there, which is fair if you look at it that way. But I wanted to ask you this hypothetical question.
Yeah, here was the number. I have it here on the. Please, I called my chart up. It's six quarterbacks who were drafted first overall. 6 of the 28 starting quarterbacks since 2000. 6 of them were drafted first overall, which is 21.4%.
Perfect. So, again, I realize that when you look at that one way, that seems not great. But let me ask it to you this way, and bear with me for 2 seconds here, because it's going to seem silly, but I'm illustrating a point. I want you to imagine, Paul, that you live in a house that has only just started to be built, and your contractor left on you. So you're living in basically an abandoned house. You have a few things. You have a couch, you got, a refrigerator, you got a few things. You don't have a roof. You have no roof on this house. So you need a lot of stuff in this house. But most importantly, you need a roof. Now, in your house, there's a room, and every day, and let's say there's 7 months in a year now, and there's about 32 days in every month, like the draft. Now, if I told you that every day in that room, something that you need in your house is going to magically appear, but you don't know what it's going to be, and you only get to go in there one day each month. And if I told you that on the very first day of January, there's a 21% chance that you're going to get a roof. And then after that, like on the second day, it immediately drops to like 8%. And then on the third day, it drops to 4%. And by the time you get to February, you're like at a less than 1% chance that you're getting a roof in that room. Maybe you're going to get, a stove, or maybe Eric Flowers is in that room one day, but you need the roof. And my point is,
go ahead.
If you knew that even though 21% is not 70%, it's far and away the best chance you have. You're telling me that you're not opening that door January 1st is your day in January to try and get your roof?
Well, I'm going to push your analogy aside a second and make it really about football.
That was some analogy, by the way.
Because that's what this is about. This is about football. The problem is you're not making that pick in a bubble. If you take the shot at the 21% at the first overall pick, which the Giants don't have, by the way.
Yeah, I mean.
But if you were going to.
Right.
Okay? It's not just you're taking the shot and you're relying on that 21%, but you're bypassing the potential other guy who's a better blue chip prospect at another position. I mean, let's put it to you this way, and I'm going to come back and ask you a question. If
Please.
Travis Hunter and Abdul Carter are consensus 1-2 blue chip Pro Bowl caliber prospects in this draft, and there's no quarterback higher than 15 on a scout's grading system, why would you pass on one of those two guys to draft a guy who's 15th on your grading system? And you're going to say to me, well, because he's a quarterback. Well, I'm going to then say to you, well, but the chances of the quarterback hitting in a bubble are not very good. So not only do you screw up if that guy fails, but you've also missed out on the blue chip guy who's going to go to 5 or 6 Pro Bowls in the next 10 years, who was going to do an awful lot to help perhaps your defense or your offensive skill positions, because after all, this is a team game. Now, if your quarterback has a top 3 grade. If he's a Justin Herbert, who, again, I've used him on many occasions in this conversation because I thought Justin Herbert was awesome, and I had hoped that the Giants would be in position to take him when he came out because that's a guy I would have jumped to the podium for. And I wouldn't have even discussed this about any other positions because I thought that the consensus on him was that high. That's not the case with the guys in this class. It's just not. You're going to pass up on an Abdul Carter or a Travis Hunter or a Mason Graham to take a 21% chance at a substandard quarterback class? To me, that's not a great gamble. If you want to take that gamble, God bless you. You're welcome to do it. You really are. You're not wrong to do it. You're welcome to do it. That's why everybody has to make their own pick because there's no right answer here. I'm not a gambler by nature. I'm just not.
And Alex, we'll let you go on that note. Appreciate the phone call. I mean, I also think it's a little unfair to just look at it through the lens of Super Bowl appearances because you're looking at it at the ultimate pinnacle. Like, what I would be looking for is, if I draft a quarterback number 1 overall, how many times has his production helped my team make the playoffs in a given span?
See,
that to me is a better indication of whether or not you get good bang for your buck, not whether or not he made a Super Bowl appearance or your team won a Super Bowl. I just think that's way too narrow.
And I understand that. And the biggest problem with any of these conversations is that football is the ultimate team sport. And I know you feel this way, and I think you'll understand when I say it to you. To even isolate this to a quarterback in a bubble is almost laughable, to be frank. Even though it's the most important position on the field, and he does touch the ball on every offensive possession. I totally understand that. Every offensive snap, not just possession. But there is so much that goes into it, that do I really need to remind anybody what Eli Manning had to go through with the offensive lines that he had to play behind? There is so much that goes into it that it's almost silly to actually even do any of this stuff and talk about, well, the quarterback really is going to determine the fate of your team. Okay, he is the most important guy. Absolutely he is. But my God, Archie Manning was one of the most talented losing quarterbacks that this league has ever seen. And I don't know if you remember Archie playing.
Yeah,
did you watch it?
No, I can't say I've watched it, but I'm well aware of what he did and what he went through.
He was universally regarded. Everybody felt bad for Archie Manning back in the day, in the 70s, because he was viewed as the most talented, most gifted quarterback who ever got resigned to purgatory because he was with the New Orleans Saints. And my God, that line was like worse than Swiss cheese, worse than a wet tissue. It was brutal. And this poor guy, everybody around the league felt sympathy for him because he was such a talented, all-universe kind of talent. But because of where he played, he literally got the stuffing kicked out of him every single week, and that team never went anywhere, and his stats were really substandard. I mean, I think he made a couple of Pro Bowls, believe it or not, in spite of the fact that the team was simply horrific. They had nothing to work with. Well, you don't want that either. It's a team game. You've said this on this program multiple times. It's a team game. So that's why the caller, I appreciate what he's saying, but again, there's a cost. If you gamble and reach and force a quarterback much higher than he should be, it's not just did you hit or miss on that guy. If you missed, you also bypassed potentially the blue chipper at another position. For example, if Abdul...
every team can relate to that. Yeah.
Exactly. If Abdul Carter is really, quote, Micah Parsons 2.5.0 or whatever the heck they want to call him, how would you feel if you missed out on him?
Well, of course it would hurt, but I guess my counter to that would be, does Abdul Carter move the needle as much as finding a quarterback that gives you stability under center? And that, I think, is a much more fascinating and substantive
conversation. Well, the bigger question there is, again, what do you think of the current quarterback class?
Sure, but
again, if Justin Herbert's in the, I got no qualms with it. Justin Herbert's in this class. I'm running to the podium. I'm taking Justin Herbert.
I don't.
And by the way, if Drake May was in this class, I would take Drake May at number 3. I would. I felt that strongly about him, but he's not.
Well, 2 things. Number one, if Cam Ward or Shedeur Sanders is a top 10 player in your evaluation, then I don't think taking him at 3 is a stretch. That to me is not a crazy jump, Paul, I would argue. If he's a 20th overall player and you're taking him 3, all right, maybe you're pushing the scales. But if you have him as your 10th through 12th best player and you want to take him at 3, I don't think that's crazy. So that's number one. Number 2, in terms of, the pros and minuses of what you're missing out on, that happens with players at other positions, not just quarterbacks. I mean, if you go through the draft from last year or 2 years prior, there could have been a team that took a cornerback. Cornerback didn't pan out. And we could have went, well, look at who went after the next
Correct.
pick, a wide receiver.
Correct.
Well, what would have their life been if they would have taken the wide receiver?
Exactly why there's no right or wrong answer.
Yeah.
Because every single decision you make when you're this high in the draft is a crapshoot. There is no right or wrong answer.
There's always risk and reward.
Hindsight is going to tell you what the better answer was. And that's it. Hindsight's the only thing that's accurate in the NFL draft. The only thing.
I just think from the Giants' perspective in terms of what's different this year, where they're picking. You had mentioned if Herbert's in this class, if Drake May's in this class, without any hesitation, you take a quarterback at 3.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's say you don't have the guy that you want, so you pass on the quarterback at 3. Okay, they bring in a veteran who gets them through a year or 2. You're still back to square one, though, is my point, Paul. You have not done anything to move yourself closer to any form of stability at quarterback. And you don't know where they're going to pick 2 years from now or 3 years from now.
Of course not.
So that's something that, whether it's ideal or not, I think you have to weigh against what you think of this group of quarterbacks, because when you're this high, you have to say, we may not be this high a year or 2 later on, when maybe there's an attractive cluster of quarterbacks. And the Giants, they can't survive. To bring it back to the last caller's point, I know he brought up Matthew Stafford, and I didn't disagree with his assessment, but you could bring in a veteran quarterback here. Eventually, the Giants are going to have to find somebody young enough to grow, develop, and try to be the guy over just beyond a 3 to 4 year stretch.
And
that's where I'm returning to.
I really hate that we're belaboring this.
Well, listen, it's a huge topic.
It's very troublesome.
It's going to go on and on this offseason.
But I think a lot of people shut off. They hear certain words and then they shut off the rest of it. I'm not saying don't draft one.
I didn't say you were doing that.
Well, a lot of people seem to think that.
I'm not insinuating that.
What
I'm
suggesting is, if you get the appropriate veteran who's going to give you as many as 3 years as a starter and really has some good football left in him, well, then you could reach a little bit and take more of a project quarterback and take a second rounder or a third rounder. I have absolutely no objection if the Giants get a big name veteran in the next 3 weeks to be their starting quarterback in 2025. I absolutely have no problem whatsoever. In fact, I would take one of the other quarterbacks later on in the draft. I don't have a problem with that.
Just out of curiosity, to expand.
It might be the second round. It might be the third round. It might even be the fourth round.
Give me a name or two when you say a veteran.
Well,
so I know where you're coming from. Who are we talking about?
Well, the top shelf of veterans who are supposedly available, again, folks, this is all hypothetical, but guys who are supposedly available on the market. Now it turns out maybe Derek Carr is going to be available. I see over the weekend now they're saying that the Saints may be parting ways with Derek Carr.
Salary cap, yeah.
We know that Kirk Cousins is potentially available. We know that Matthew Stafford, the Rams have already said, they've told his people they can go talk. Well, Russell Wilson's another one. Now, Russell Wilson, to me, has got a shorter shelf life than Carr, than Stafford, than Cousins. I think Wilson's shelf life is probably a little bit shorter. He from the eye test this past year, he looks like he's a little bit more on the down than those other three guys. But you're talking about four top-tier named quarterbacks.
Well,
if you get any one of those type guys, if you're Team X looking to bring in a veteran, there's no reason for you to have to use your first-round pick on a young QB. You could easily take one in the second, third. All right, if you don't want to go to the fourth, you don't have to go to the fourth round. But you don't need to use your third overall pick. Why would you do that?
Well,
if you could draft a Carter or a Hunter or a Graham and literally give your defense an incredible shot of adrenaline to go with that quarterback who's going to win you games, come on.
Well, my concern would be, that's why I asked you for specific names. Okay, Stafford, who I know would have to be a trade, and this is all hypothetical conversation to preface my comments. We're talking about he's going into year 17, Paul, okay? Year 17 for a veteran quarterback? Look at what happened to Kirk Cousins. And you know me from this show, I've been a huge proponent of Kirk Cousins, but Kirk, because of injuries or whatever it may be, it didn't pan out for Atlanta. When Atlanta made that move, they were thinking, Paul, exactly what you were thinking. They were saying, we're going to be in good position for the next 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, they took a guy coming off a torn Achilles, though.
Okay, but my point is,
it makes a difference.
You got to prepare, though.
It makes a difference.
But you have to prepare. Derek Carr's been through a number of injuries, and he's going into, let's see, this is year 11,
Lance,
year 12.
I'm so exhausted with this topic.
Listen, there's different layers to this, Paul.
But that's why, for me, if you take a Jackson Dart, let's say, again, we don't know where he's going to land. Some people think he could sneak into the first round. Other people think he will not. If you take someone of that ilk, there's certainly enough that's been written about him that he's got consensus red chip prospect written all over him. He's not a blue chip, but he's a red chip. I'm not suggesting you wait till the 6th round.
I know exactly where you're coming from.
Joe Smith from Indiana Technical University. I'm not suggesting that.
I heard they have a good football program, but go ahead.
They may.
Yeah.
Or for that matter, some Division III guy from Canada. I'm not suggesting that. What I'm saying is you could easily go to the second tier and not take the risk because you can beef up with some other blue chippers at other positions. That's all.
It's just, I think the level of upside may still not be as high once you start taking a quarterback in the second or the third round. So you at least need to look at it through that lens. All I'm saying is, listen, I'm a big believer in it's worth going after a veteran quarterback, no matter what they do in the draft. But what I'm arguing is guys like Cousins, guys like Stafford, Carr, Russell Wilson, all come with some level of risk. Maybe not the same level of risk, but just because they are proven commodities, whether it's where they are in their careers, whether it's their injury baggage, whether it's you don't know what's going to happen this coming year, you can't assume that you bought yourself a cushion of a 2 to 3 year time period. That's all where I'm coming from. And that's all I wanted to emphasize based on what you were saying.
Every move that's made by a general manager carries risk and gamble.
Yeah.
There is no, again, I'm going back to this. There's no right answer except hindsight. That's it. Hindsight's the only thing that proves true.
The problem is you're not making the decision with hindsight, though, when you go out and you acquire or sign a guy or whatever it may be. All right, let's head back to the phone lines. We check in with Antonio in Delaware here on BBKL. What's happening, Antonio? What do you got for us?
Hey, how you guys doing?
Doing all right. What's on your mind?
Yeah, I have a quick comment to make and also a whole thing about this quarterback situation. My quick comment is about Joe Schoen. Right now, Joe Schoen is probably the most disliked person in Giants country right now, and the only way for him to redeem himself is to have a decent he must come out of this free agency with some decent players, and also he must come out of this draft with a potential All-Pro and a potential Pro Bowl player.
Okay, and what's the...
Well, caller, here's what I will say before you go on. I do think it's important to acknowledge what you just said, because the one thing to this point that we had said for a long time is that Joe Schoen had yet to draft a Pro Bowl player. Of course, it turned out because of injuries and guys dropping out, it turned out Malik Neighbors actually did become a Pro Bowl player this year as a rookie. But to your point, caller, I think Joe Schoen has drafted okay. He's gotten a bunch of players who have played a bunch of snaps for this team and a bunch of starters. But the thing he had not done up until the recent dropout of some wide receivers was draft a Pro Bowl player. Neighbors has finally ended that streak, although, again, it was kind of a mutated advancement for him. I agree with you. They're picking number 3 in this draft. Man, oh man, oh man, they got to get it right. And that draft room, when number 3 comes up on the board, it is mandatory that everybody in that room slams their fist on the table and says, this is the guy we need to pick. And you know what? If they all get up and scream, we got to have Sanders or we got to have Ward, I don't give a horse's butt what position the guy plays. They got to make the pick because that's what this is all about. It's about the scouts and the personnel department and the guys who have spent months and months and years studying these guys. And if they're all in agreement at the number 3 pick, then that's the guy you have to take. And it doesn't matter what he thinks, and it doesn't matter what I think. Point blank. Let me make that very, very clear. The Giants need to pick the guy who they believe is going to give them the most bang for their buck at number 3. And I don't care what position the guy plays. I really don't. They got to get it right.
I also wouldn't get caught up in labels of Pro Bowl. I mean, all pro is probably a better indication. I think your point is
impact player.
That's what I was going to get to. I was going to get to the term. The term is impactful players that could change the course of the direction of the franchise and can show up consistently week in and week out and steer games in your direction. Whether they get a Pro Bowl nod or an All-Pro nod, it more often than not is completely out of their control, and it's based on a player vote or a media vote. Get guys that when they step on the field, they move the needle. That's what I would label.
Well, impact player. We're throwing around the Pro Bowl nomenclature only because it's easy to throw that out there.
But it's not always a telling sign, is what I'm getting
The most impactful player, that until Neighbors was Thibodeau. His drafting, but that was the previous year.
Sure, and Thibodeau has also had issues in terms of staying healthy too.
And he has not been a Pro Bowl player.
Yeah.
Anyway, go ahead.
What was you had another statement you wanted to make, Antonio?
Yes, and also in terms of these free agent quarterbacks, is basically pick your poison. You have quarterbacks that are towards the end of their careers, just aging, and also you have quarterbacks that have not played enough games to warrant them giving a decent contract to play for the Giants. So right now, the Giants are in a it's a bad time for the New York Giants to be looking for a quarterback. Basically all around. For any team that's looking for a quarterback, it's just basically a bad timing. Because right now you got the money for this year is going to go up. So therefore, all these teams now have more money to spend to retain their players. So right now, everything is going against the Giants in terms of trying to find the best free agent quarterback.
Well, that's why. Listen, I didn't mean to cut you off, Antonio. We want to get to a few other callers. I'll let you go on that point. But that's why it's ideal to get the quarterback through the draft, to exactly what the last caller was pointing out, because you don't want to be in this position. And the reason why is because any team that finds a really good quarterback is probably going to, A, give him an extension, or B, give him the franchise tag, which means they're never going to hit free agency. So if your answer is we're going to go into the free agent pool to get an answer, it's not wise. And I would agree with you, you're not going to necessarily get a savior depending on what you're looking for, because once again, the draft is the way to go to find a stabilizing individual under center. So, there are a mixture of players to the caller's point, on the back end, to intrigue maybe because of where a guy like Sam Darnold ended up last season, to younger guys like Justin Fields who have been moved around and have intrigue. So there's not a whole lot of proven commodities, but I don't think you have to go on a spending spree for all of those guys. I think 2 or 3 of those guys you could take a chance on, not have to break and open the piggy bank, and still have maybe somebody to test the waters with this season. That's not crazy at all.
Well, the whole philosophy about getting the bridge of the veteran quarterback took on a whole new perspective when it started to become obvious recently that these big 4 names were now suddenly in limbo. I mean, until it became part of the rumor mill that Stafford and Cousins and Wilson and Carr, since the season ended, were all realistic shots to be available, you had to just look at free agency and say the Giants, if they were going to get a bridge, they were going to have to find the best fit and the best value for the economic money that, the monies or the economic range that they were willing to participate in. That was one equation. And we had our opinions about the kind of guys we talked about. And then, since then, as time has gone on, week by week, it seems more obvious that these other 4 guys who are on a totally different shelf, they're not on this shelf at the store, they're on the higher shelf. They're going to cost you more to get because they're of a higher ilk. They've got a better resume than the rest of these other guys who are in the free agent class. That changed everything. And as far as I'm concerned, it changed everything. I when we originally looked at it and just said free agency, get the bridge, that was a totally different equation and a totally different question than these other guys who kind of got thrown into the pool on the back end of this thing.
Well, but I mean, in fairness, Stafford and Carr, I don't look at, even if we go down the hypothetical road, you may have to give up trade assets to acquire one or both of them.
Carr maybe not the way it's sounding now with New Orleans. He might get set free.
Okay, but the point is, both of those guys, you may have to give up assets in addition to a contract.
Likely for Stafford, it sounds like.
So you're not left with the 4, is my point. It's not fair to look at it as all 4 are going to be available to literally go out and woo them.
No, you do. That's exactly what it is.
Well, Stafford,
because
it's
the 4 guys are on a higher shelf, which you're going to have to spend more for, whether it's money or draft or both.
Sure,
they're on a more expensive shelf.
No, that I agree, but both is in a different stratosphere than just spending money on them, because you have to give up picks for another guy.
No doubt.
I don't group them in. That's all I'm saying. I don't group them all together.
They're on a different shelf.
And still, I would even agree with the last caller, though, that there's still risk where they are at their careers to not necessarily be the answer immediately. If we're talking about a guy 7 years into his NFL career that hits free agency, that's a lot more attractive than a guy entering year 17 or year 14, too.
No doubt.
So that also changes things. All right, let's head back to the phone lines.
Those guys don't get to be available.
Well, that's why you got to draft them. That circles back to my initial point. Listen, I'm not disputing that.
Almighty.
Len is in Columbia, Maryland. What's happening, Len?
Hey, guys. Paul, Lance, nice to talk to you again.
You too.
Well, I'm going to stay on topic for a reason. I think you guys have said this in a number of different ways over the last 3 or 4 weeks, and that is we can't underestimate the challenge that the Giants face in filling that quarterback room. There's nobody in there, just a bunch of empty chairs. Paul, you mentioned earlier that it may not be just one quarterback, 2 quarterbacks. You started thinking 3 or 4 new guys that we need to get in that room. Here's my answer to it. It's pretty consistent, Paul. I don't think Lance has heard this, but I've talked to you a little bit about this. I'm looking bridge, and I'm looking for a short bridge because I'm taking the gamble, Paul, at number 3. I'm drafting a quarterback. And I think one of those 2 guys, I hope it's Ford, but I'll take Sanders. I want one of those 2 guys at the number 3 pick. So I'm going with a short bridge quarterback. I'm not paying more than $20 million for 2 years. pay up to $12 million guaranteed. So it's a 2-year contract, approximately 20 if we go that high.
Len, I don't mean to cut you off. It sounds like
and
I'm leaning toward the
same guy I've been leaning towards for the last 6 weeks, Paul. I'm looking at Mariota. He gives us the running ability that the quarterback has to have today. And I think that's the way we go forward at the quarterback position. We got the veteran, we got the rookie. You want to bring Tommy back, you bring Tommy back. It's not going to be an expensive contract, obviously.
No, it would not be.
All right, Len, yeah. I'm just going to let you go because we're getting background noise. I think you got the show on in the background. Appreciate the phone call. Mariota, though, I mean, you got to understand you're limited to me in terms of the ceiling, Paul, if that's your answer, even as a bridge guy. I mean, if Mariota wants to be one of the insurance policies, I get that. But if he's going to be your starter from day one, I think your expectations need to be a little bit more realistic in terms of what you could do with him at this point in his career.
I would agree.
So I think if I'm in a position where I'm choosing, I mean, I would make a bigger splash, even to Len's point. If you're looking for a shorter bridge, there's room to leave your mark a little bit more in that pool than just Mariota, in my opinion. Now, whether or not you could get him in with that $10 million budget, you know, that may be a bit of wishful thinking, unless there's some incentives built in. And the reason why you got to take into consideration the money, I'll bring up an earlier caller, I think, who was bringing up Stafford. These veteran quarterbacks, Paul, you know, where they are in their careers, how attractive do they look at the Giants as a destination? Wouldn't you say they want to win right now at this stage in their career? They want to have a realistic shot to do damage. And where the Giants are, can they accomplish that in the short period of time that you're giving them a contract? That's ball is in their court.
That is absolutely one of the factors that any guy who has an extensive resume is going to think about on the back end of his career. He's going to want to think about chances to win. He's going to want to think about opportunity to be in a certain kind of locker room. He's going to want to think about how much money can I make. He's going to want to think about, well, if I go to New York and I actually do pretty well, man, it's going to blow up my Q factor multiple times. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. After what the Giants have gone through for the better part of the last decade, the quarterback who comes in here, whatever it is, 25, 26, 27, whatever year it is, the starting quarterback for the next Giants team that makes the playoffs is going to get a tremendous amount of fan support and consequently probably a very sweet marketing deal on top of whatever it is he's making playing football, because that's the way it usually goes. Right? The quarterback is the magnet. He gets most of the blame when a team loses. He gets most of the praise when a team wins. And the guy who turns around the Giants' fortune and is taking that snap under center is going to suddenly become incredibly heralded from the top of the Empire State Building. They'll put the colors up on the antenna for him. So there's some ego involved in this too. Okay, some guys want to come to a place like New York for that challenge and for that opportunity to really blow it up. Others, no. They won't want to come to New York because they're intimidated by it.
Well, I mean, I wasn't going to go so far as intimidation.
But it is part of it.
It's possible. I'm looking at it more of the upside of the team. That's how I'm looking at it.
That's only one component, though.
But
there are a lot of components.
No, and
of course, Stafford's brother-in-law being on the Giants coaching staff, family could be another component as well.
No, absolutely. But I think where all of these guys that we talked about, the main theme is they're not youngsters. They've put in their time in the NFL. And I think if you ask most quarterbacks when they get beyond year 10, year 11, they know they don't have as much leeway, right, in terms of the volume of years they can still play.
Well, two of the four veterans that we talked about on the top shelf have won a Super Bowl before. So in that regard, that's not the missing piece to their careers. They will have other priorities when they consider their final landing spot.
Sure.
But two of the four have not won a Super Bowl ring, and I'm sure that's probably one of their driving forces to keep playing.
Well, but I also think even the ones that won a Super Bowl, and you're referring to Stafford and Wilson, just so the audience can follow, doesn't mean that they still don't want to win and compete and try to get into the playoffs.
I
That's all
just
I'm
said
saying.
their priorities will likely be a little bit different than guys who haven't won one.
That's
all?
No, I think the perspective changes. No, it's an interesting point. I would argue a quarterback at this point in their career, the perspective changes when the options are limited or non-existent. Meaning, if only one team is offering you a legitimate starting job, at the end of the day, beggars can't be choosers, right?
That's why Russell Wilson went to the Steelers, because he was of the belief he was going to beat out Justin Fields and was going to start for a team that was probably going to the playoffs. And it worked exactly as he wanted it to.
But the upside of that team was a lot more attractive. I wasn't going to use Russ. I thought Russ had options. So I wasn't going to bring up Russ under that context.
He was.
No, Russ to me is not the example. To me, Stafford's going to have probably his fair share of suitors. There's going to be a team that feels we bring in Stafford, he elevates us enough.
Well, that's why the Rams are letting him talk to other teams to find out about the market, because they think there'll be more than one.
Derek Carr, I think he'll have his fair share of suitors too, especially if they believe that he can elevate what they've been working with in previous years.
I found it odd he didn't get more attention when the Raiders were ready to move on from him. He didn't get as much ringing of the phone as I thought he was going to get.
Well, I mean, I got to go back and look at the other teams that were interested. Well, the Jets showed some interest.
But they were really lukewarm because they wanted Rodgers the whole time.
But that because the Jets had another option.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is you now don't have another option and Carr is the main guy. It may change the outlook of some of these teams.
If people are willing to spend either money and or picks, it does appear like there are now 4 very accomplished guys who can be had. So there are other options.
Well, I think if you were to assess the 4, to me, I think because of the season Kirk is coming off of, the age and the injury, he may not have the overwhelming suitors compared to the others.
Yeah, but there's offset language in the Falcons' contract, so you're going to get him a lot cheaper on the financial part of it than any of the other guys.
Sure, but
which does make him, in that regard, more attractive.
No, just like when Russell Wilson, Denver was paying off the money. No, I get that.
Correct.
But I would argue Russ had a little bit more in the tank coming off even the problematic Denver season versus what Kirk went through this past year in Atlanta. It's hard to look at it apples to apples because I do think there's some differences.
Depends on how the scouts feel about it.
No, without a doubt. And hey, if you can get Kirk on the cheap and you draft a quarterback and you think he'll be good for the room, I can understand you making that decision. I just think, once again, you've got to be realistic that he's not going to necessarily be the guy that you should bank on to maybe even make it through an upcoming season because of where he's at.
Like I say, it's always a crapshoot. And then when you've been through some rough years like the Giants have been, and you have a situation where you really need to show some significant progress right away, that also changes the equation.
Well, I'm with you. The Giants, they're going to show the aggressiveness. The question is, does the player want to meet the team halfway? That's where I'm coming from. I'm not doubting the team's willingness, but it takes 2 to tango, right? Does the quarterback then want to say,
Always does.
I respect the aggressiveness
You
of the
can't
team.
make a guy sign here if he doesn't want to sign here. And that's the bottom line
100%.
with every player.
Yeah, because remember, Russell Wilson did meet with the Giants last year in the offseason.
Very briefly, that was the report.
Correct. And then he wound up joining the Steelers. So, you could talk to a quarterback, doesn't mean necessarily you're going to finish the deal.
Can't make that horse drink.
That's the old story. Absolutely. All right. That is going to wrap up today's program. Certainly appreciate everybody for tuning in. The rest of the week, it'll be all from Indianapolis, as we'll have full combine coverage, as today's program, as every other program, I should say, moving forward too, is part of the Giants platforms everywhere and Giants.com/podcasts. For Paul Dottino, I'm Lance Meadow, signing off here on Monday's edition of Big Blue Kickoff Live. Stay locked to Giants.com for all the latest, and we'll speak to you from Indy beginning on Tuesday. Have a good one.